Okay, and we're live. Sorry, Dan, you need to unmute.
Hello, everyone.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our the first installment of our spring lecture series. And I will introduce our guest speaker in just a moment. I want to remind everyone that we have several more of these lectures coming up, always on Tuesdays, either at noon or 4 p.m., including next week, April 6th, Matthew Urbanski, who is partner at Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, who's going to talk about the design and creation of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And on 4/13 at noon, Sonam Sahu is a climate change consultant who will be talking about reaching climate change commitments at the local level, and her case study is Mumbai. So please join us for those lectures as well. So for today's lecture, I have the privilege of, of introducing our old colleague and pal, Jeremy Kargon. And I know many of you are interested to hear what Jeremy's been up to. Maybe he'll say a word or two about it. But Jeremy is now project architect with CRGA Design, a Baltimore-based firm that works primarily in the healthcare sector. Jeremy, if you didn't know, has degrees from Yale and Columbia and has been a licensed architect since 1991. He's practiced both in the US and in Israel almost for a decade. And he has very diverse scholarly interests. And I think we're going to hear some of that today. Broadly, his scholarship explores the representation of architecture and its diverse manifestations within different cultures. Move my email down a bit. Next. Jeremy is also active with Baltimore Society of Design Arts and has served on its planning committee since 2010. He has many other local, national, and international affiliations. I won't go through them all. Many of you know him already. He is indeed a Renaissance person. It is my pleasure now to introduce Jeremy Kargon.
All right. Well, listen, I have to push some buttons before we get started, so just bear with me. I need to push this button and that button, and I'm going to push this button and one more button. And now, can everybody see the screen? Well, give me a thumbs up if you can see it.
We can see the screen.
Excellent. Okay, so listen, greetings, everyone. It's great to be back with the SAP lecture series, this time on the other side of the proscenium. It feels like only yesterday that I was in Zoom sessions with students, and here I am again. So I want to thank, first of all, Dan and Sarah Troutbetter and the others on the lecture series committee for inviting me to share this material. And I want to thank Evan Richardson and Nakara Williams for helping out with the promotion of the event. There are plenty others to thank, but I better get on with it. So I'll talk afterwards about what prompted me to collect the material that I'm about to present and why I think it's worth collecting. But I'll start with the following anecdote. Okay, in 1977, around the time that this new housing development named Coldspring, around the time that it opened up to its first residents, Baltimore's housing commissioner was at the time a fellow named Jay Brody, a friend of our program, and he was also one of these initial residents. And so he was asked how the city came to hire Moshe Safdie. And he said, quote, "We told him we were not interested in another habitat in Baltimore." Now, of course, Moshe Safdie won the Baltimore Commission in 1971 because of this project, Habitat 67, which brought his name to attention worldwide, including among the planners and politicians in this mid-Atlantic port city of Baltimore. None of the other projects that Safdie had designed had come to fruition beyond a handful of test structures. So if Baltimore's planners did not want another habitat in Baltimore, there must have been something in Habitat that they saw as applicable to their city's housing problems. You know, what was that something? How was reporting on Habitat, I'm going to move this out of the way here, bear with me here. How was reporting on Habitat 67 interpreted among Baltimoreans interested in design, interested in housing, interested in urban development. So in what follows, I'll argue that Coldspring's proponents saw, at least initially, the following prospects. They saw housing as an industrial process, which would lead to local jobs as well as homes. They saw housing as a social statement, which addressed patterns of behavior that had impacted Baltimore's growth. They saw housing as topography, as a way of solving physical challenges posed by the site's natural features. They saw housing as boosterism, attracting political and social capital due to Coldspring's unique design and Safdie's own celebrity status. Yet key figures in Baltimore saw in Habitat something else too. Housing as infrastructure, tying together all these things within an integrated architectural form. So at the start of the 1970s, this emphasis on infrastructure improved the project's political feasibility and even its pro forma. But as it turned out, the eventual costs of such an emphasis undermined Coldspring's eventual completion. So at the project's conception, sort of the where of the city, the where of the project was what made it unique. Unlike other new towns of the time, such as Columbia, Maryland, just located 20 miles outside of Baltimore, as you see at the lower left, Coldspring was located within Baltimore's municipal boundaries. The parcel's vacancy at the time was a result of its terrain. Coldspring's 375-acre site lay on a steep rise to the west of the Jones Falls. North of Coldspring was an existing nature preserve, Silburn, and south of the parcel was, of course, a large municipal park, Druid Hill. Before Safdie was involved, when this project was first floated by the city fathers in 1968, Coldspring was expected to house more than 10,000 residents. Safdie was hired in 1971, and in 1972, the city released his initial plans. His original design included 3,780 housing units, along with a town center, peripheral amenities, and a medical center. Safdie proposed in this design 3 housing types. The deck houses built over structured parking, cluster houses of several units each, linked by walkways spanning streets and steep terrain, and high-rise structures set against the excavated walls of an existing quarry. Now, of the 3 types of buildings, the cluster houses in the middle that you see here came closest to Habitat's terraced interpenetrating geometry. Now, by 1981, when Coldspring's second and final phase had been completed, only 252 units had been built, exclusively, as you see here, of the deck house type. None of the commercial structures were ever built, and over time, the bulk of the site was given to other developers who built conventional single-family homes, and you can see them in the background. This is today's Coldspring Newtown. It's a small enclave in verdant surroundings, either a missed opportunity or a cautionary tale, depending on the political leanings of whoever's giving the opinion. Now, things looked and were very different back in 1968. In August of that year, the Housing and Urban Development Act was passed, promising more than $5 billion to promote the construction of new homes around the country. And just a month before, Baltimore City Council consolidated the local housing agency with the Bureau of Building Inspection, creating a single department with oversight and development capacity. To lead the new department, Baltimore's Mayor Tommy D'Alessandro III appointed Robert C. Embry Jr., who was the key figure in Coldspring's development. He had trained as a lawyer, not as a planner, but his coursework at Harvard included a senior seminar with Charles M. Haar, a land planning legal theorist who later contributed to the Model Cities program. Embry's studies at Harvard also coincided with Ed Loeb's tenure as head of the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and that's no coincidence. Embry told me that, quote, Loeb became something of a hero and model of mine, unquote. And what that meant for Baltimore's new housing commission was a commitment to improving conditions for the full spectrum of the city's constituents, including the middle class as well as the urban poor. Now, what that meant tactically was the need to innovate projects qualifying for federal funds, otherwise unavailable for housing. So it was Embry who first conceived the Coldspring development, a preliminary planning project in Baltimore's Park Heights neighborhood, uncovered local residents' concerns for the nearby Coldspring site, which was then vacant. What was its potential, they were asking, for urban development? Now, Embry saw that Baltimore's share of federal dollars could be increased by tackling infrastructure as well as housing. And here I'm quoting Embry again. To develop Coldspring required a great deal of infrastructure work because it was a very hilly site. And there happened to be EDA money for infrastructure. So it made available money to provide the sewer and the roads. Now, EDA was the Federal Economic Development Administration, the focus of which was job creation and industrial growth in struggling rural and urban areas. So Embry saw that the ways in which federal dollars had been made available to American cities required broadening the constituency of urban development. And another quote, "We had used all the low-income public housing money that was available, so I thought we should create something that would be an attraction to middle-class people and should be developed in a way that could call attention to Baltimore, and that was a unique development physically." Now, by November 1968, Embry and his staff had convinced Mayor D'Alessandro to announce a new town on the Coldspring site. Now, quite obviously, Coldspring was located within an old American city, but by calling it a new town, they might convince administrators in Washington that fallow urban land should qualify for HUD money. And so it did. Now, there were some politicians who objected. One of them argued that jobs, not homes, should be the city's priority. And so Coldspring's land would be better used for an industrial park. Others pointed to a nearby nature preserve, as I mentioned, Silburn, which might be affected by new development on its southern periphery. Now, neither of those arguments convinced the board, which voted in December of '68 to endorse the Coldspring initiative. But these complaints would resurface repeatedly over the next decade. Behind the scenes, such objections mirrored divisions among Baltimore's fractious ethnic groups. Established white homeowners sought to maintain Coldspring's undeveloped land as a buffer between them and the growing Black community, which in turn saw Coldspring as an opportunity for better housing. You can hear for yourself the kind of discussions held over Coldspring in filmed account of these arguments. Okay, I'm going to play this video here.
But over and above that, we're extremely concerned about the opportunity for the improvement of life and for better housing for the people who are already jammed one on top of the other in the city. And I think the people from Silburn ought to be as concerned about this question as much as they are about the wildlife and the birds and the bees, because this is our deep concern. But you have fought the thing every step of the way in terms of Silburn, and you have not commented one time in terms of the promises of the good life for people who may move into this, and I'm deeply concerned about that.
And I'm going to share the next video. I think, I'm going to share this video, which is the retort of the Silburn Commission to that very direct point of view.
Speaking for Silburn, I don't think that we have ever gone on record as opposing the question of having better housing for people. All we're attempting to do is to preserve what we think is necessary for what we represent.
But we who live in this city and are deeply concerned with this whole question.
Well, now that brings up another question, which is an important question to my thinking. Have you resolved yet, by any chance, the income group that would support this? I mean, would it be in the neighborhood of people in the $10,000 bracket? Yes. Or would it be below that?
So just to continue, I mean, as you heard, what might present itself from a priori as a substantive argument about ecology devolves very quickly into dog whistles and coded language for objections to integration, as you just heard. There we go. But perhaps also what was at issue is what constituted better housing was by no means subject to consensus. Baltimore's historical fabric is composed primarily of the row house, celebrated since the 19th century as a model of salubrious dwelling for rich and poor alike. Well before the 1960s, however, local planners saw that the traditional row house development model could not address problems like falling population density and spatial segregation by race. Yet apartment buildings with units arranged in flats had never been popular in Baltimore, and modernist high-rise public housing was already a visible failure by the mid-1960s. And so it was in this context that Habitat 67 first came to Baltimoreans' attention. Now, early newspaper reporting of coverage of Habitat was generally favorable. One article interpreted the project's design in the following ways. Imagine living in the suburbs, in the city, an unimpeded view of scenery with perfect privacy and quiet, elevated streets and walks which never expose the pedestrians to traffic. And once again, they reiterate complete suburb plus city within a city. This same author adds that Habitat's ability to provide these things is possible only through prefabrication. Now, this was a message that was enthusiastically received by at least one Baltimore developer, a guy named Morton Sarubin. In 1967, Sarubin that he would hire Safdie to design a 200-apartment, 14-story building, and this project would be assembled with prefabricated units manufactured by a newly built factory close by. Now, Sarubin at the time shared this image prepared by a local architect to illustrate the architectural features that Safdie would bring to the design. So in its own way, this picture is a very expressive example of what habitat looked like to local eyes. Now, fortunately, this project never got off the ground, and Safdie's records don't mention it. There is outside evidence that Sarubin had approached Safdie to collaborate, and we find that in a government publication that lists Safdie as the consulting architect on Sarubin's project, inspired by the Montreal Habitat Complex. You can see here that also there's a mention of something called the Uniment system, which is a technical process developed in the wake of Habitat by Safdie and colleagues in the United States. This may be the earliest proposed application of that process in the United States. But that's as far as this particular project went. Now, 4 years later, Coldspring was intended to be a showcase of industrialized construction. And at the time of his commission in 1971, Safdie had brought to the project what promised to be a very successful track record of prefabrication. Grandiose plans for New York, although never realized, demonstrated Safdie's willingness to iterate through technical solutions. And as you can see on the right, more importantly for Baltimore's planners, Safdie's designs for Fort Lincoln demonstrated how Safdie might extend lessons learned at Habitat even under the scrutiny of federal HUD oversight. So when Safdie's involvement with Coldspring was announced, the local press recorded that the architect hoped to open a factory in Baltimore capable of prefabricating 4,000 units a year. And in this case, it turns out that Safdie's expectation was more than just his famous optimism. To manage Coldspring's initial planning, Commissioner Embry hired the nationally known developer James Rouse and a partner of his, an English construction company, the Waits Group. Now, this Waits company had created a prefabricated construction system that had already been implemented widely in the United Kingdom. So by joining forces with Rouse, the Waits company sought to break into the American market. Not surprisingly, therefore, Safdie expected that Rouse Waits and their manufacturing capacity would realize the full scope of Coldspring's development in a very short time. Okay, but Rouse Waits eventually removed itself from the project. And even before that decision had been made, the city of Baltimore had prevaricated on prefabrication. At the very least, they realized that committing upfront to a single technology might raise rather than lower costs. In his book, For Everyone a Garden, and I have a copy of it here, Safdie wrote, quote, "The terms of the contract for Coldspring Newtown required that we should design each housing type for 3 or 4 alternative construction systems." I mean, that's crazy, but he did it. And you can see 2 of those systems here. Now, other systems included industrialized 3-dimensional modules like at Habitat and factory-produced steel walls and floors. Well, turns out after all this investigation, their grand conclusion was, well, it depends. It depends. So, and in the results, as you can see on the lower right, when the first units at Coldspring were eventually built, prefabrication was present only residually in precast floor slabs. So habitats of industrialized construction would not be followed here in Baltimore. Other than that, Baltimore's planners had hoped that Coldspring could preserve Habitat's social message. In 1969, Embry made the case for a new kind of new town planning. And he wrote in this article, quote, "What America needs are new towns that consciously make room for a certain number of low-income families, white and black, drawn for urban areas," unquote. Now, along with novel public-private partnerships, Embry proposed that the key to these new towns had to be what he called a high standard of architecture and planning. And I think reporting on Habitat 67 at the time provides the context for what Embry meant by high standard of architecture. As another journalist wrote in 67, Habitat endeavors to provide urban man the possibility of harmonious living in close quarters in a community without sacrificing privacy, outdoor areas, sunlight, covered parking, storage, and other amenities. Now, accounts like this cultivated a consistent narrative about the relationship between architecture and the social web in which its residents lived. Now, no doubt, Safdie's own words helped build that narrative. In his first book, which I also have here, Beyond Habitat, it is replete with the architect's observation about what he calls the crisis in the cities. And the book's final chapter, which addresses purely the American market, acknowledges that all questions about housing and planning are embedded in social, legal, and economic problems. Now, I mentioned earlier the developer James Rouse in the context of his partnership with the Waits Group and its connection to prefabricated construction. But Rouse himself was a significant figure in the story of American urban development at that time. All of you have been to or shopped at a Rouse project, whether it's at Harbor Place, Mondawmin Mall, Faneuil Hall in Boston, South Street, Seaport in New York, or Columbia, Maryland. So it's interesting to hear what Rouse has to say about urban problems at the time that Coldspring was being planned, and also how he said it.
The real problem with the American city is the very low level of expectancy. Nobody really expects a city to work. Nobody expects it to be good. All anybody expects is we keep patching it up and bandaging it and shoring it up and making it last another 10 years so the riots don't blow it up or tear it down. But our whole state of mind is that the American city can't work.
So for me, Rouse is a contradictory figure since successes in commercial development that he had were often interpreted by contemporary media as successes in proving that cities do work. But in fact, as a developer, his fortune was made by exploiting the cynicism that he talks about in the clip. I mean, the mall in Columbia, built around the same time as Coldspring was getting started, is perhaps the best example. So, it's not a surprise to me that he found a way to excuse himself from the Coldspring project. It really was antithetical to everything he embodied, even though he gave lip service to its very opposite. So that's anybody who wants to research that, that's a whole nother book waiting to be written. Now, I would say that on the other hand, Coldspring's planners like Embry, and certainly like Safdie himself, could criticize the status quo, but were in no way cynical. And they intended to address Baltimore's problem through design. And so to do so at Coldspring, innovative housing design was to be accompanied by innovative community planning. Coldspring would provide a health club, a theater, and even a research and development office, along with schools, police station, and stores. Now, none of these were ever built, and so Coldspring never came close to making a social statement. Moreover, Coldspring's retarded development throughout the 1970s suggested to some, especially during the conservative reaction against public housing initiatives during the following decade, that making such statements might actually undermine the goal of making homes. Now, one additional social dimension to the challenge posed by Coldspring's development was its relationship to Park Heights, the neighborhood to the west. Now, this is a topic for research which has really great potential. I mentioned a preliminary project in '68, but Safdie and his team were also commissioned to lead a process concurrent with their work in Coldspring. And Safdie explained his involvement in Park Heights in the following way.
What has emerged in the last month is that the real issue is that you cannot do Coldspring and at the same time not go through a program of rejuvenation and renovation of the area to the west, because you'd create such a contrast between living environments and living conditions that it would create destructive forces between one place and the other. And so at this point, the conclusion has been reached that as we are making plans for the new town, starting from scratch, we will, in a parallel way, or the city will, in a parallel way, make plans for the rejuvenation of Lower Park Heights and Northwest Baltimore area.
Now, you can see here part of this plan that Safdie's team published in 1975. Now, our former colleague at Morgan, the architect Stanford Britt, was appointed in 1973 to lead Safdie's branch office in Baltimore. And Stan had this to say about the process, quote, "This is the kind of project that will enable the community to participate in the decision-making process that determines their physical environment. I feel that an architect should know what the community is about, what they expect, and what they aspire to," unquote. Now, Stan Britt's words were certainly innovative in the 1970s when community-based planning of this kind was still relatively rare in American cities like Baltimore. Now, I haven't spoken with Stand-Up to discuss this project, and I haven't been able to access the city archives to determine what the city's response to the plan was. Bob Embry told me that the plan was never implemented. And of course, we're familiar with Park Heights' problems, continuing problems even today. So I think this is a yet to be told piece about the Coldspring puzzle. And I invite scholars and students in the audience to consider research on this particular topic in the future. Now, changing gears a bit, I want to go back to Habitat 67. Baltimoreans were especially taken with Habitat's approach to landscape. Habitat's site, which was a waterfront site, was actually flat, but its architecture evoked the appearance of having been made for hilly terrain. As we've seen, the Coldspring site offered diverse environmental challenges. Safdie's response was twofold: typological and formal. The design of each building type derived directly from its site. The deck houses that you see on the top were located where the site was relatively flat, and the cluster houses were located where the ground was steep. Safdie's formal response included the use of angled walls to trace the kind of Terrassenhauser imagery that Habitat evoked through its massing. In the deck houses, this motif is generally decorative and can be found in contemporary projects by other architects elsewhere, as well as by Safdie himself in Puerto Rico and Rochester designs. Now, in the cluster houses, angled walls support pitched roofs that match the fall of the ground. So visually, I mean, this is a little more integrated as a piece of architecture, but visually this roof line alludes to the imagery of suburban homes, which was a presumed selling point of this non-modernist kind of modern architecture. Otherwise, Coldspring's design balances hardscape and greenscape. Trees, lawns, and trails thread between the houses and the decks that cover the parking. On the decks, paving and structure defer to the plantings, and now that are now mature and that soften the visual effect. The result might be Coldspring's greatest success, fully consistent with Habitat's example, which is the demonstration that housing is a kind of landscape and that effective landscape design is a key component of successful housing. Now, Coldspring's planners had hoped that such amenities would create a buzz to attract home buyers back to Baltimore. Robert Embry has said, quote, "I was looking for an architect who would create a kind of excitement, who's on the cutting edge of what was going on in architecture," unquote. Now, in 1971, Safdie had just recently appeared on the cover of Newsweek and may have been, to localize, the most famous architect in the world. In December of that year, 71, a local editorial referred to the Safdie presence, exclaiming that internationally recognized for his exciting housing concepts, Mr. Safdie exudes the promise of something new, bold, and imaginative, unquote. Now, as it turned out, Safdie's talent for self-promotion afforded Coldspring's extensive exposure to high prestige venues, including books, film treatments, and even a well-traveled museum exhibit. In all of these, Coldspring stood out among all of Safdie's projects as the most grounded and the most realistic. So after all the hype, how could Coldspring not be built? Buildability, in a sense, had become the Safdie ethos. In Habitat's famous example, structured parking, pedestrian plaza level, pedestrian streets, these all thread through mechanical systems horizontally and vertically. After Habitat, and here I'm quoting my colleague Fred Charman, well, I'm paraphrasing him, Safdie continued to demand the inclusion of infrastructure in the master planner's spatial toolkit. Now, Coldspring did provide similar features connected integrally with the design of the homes. Now, doing so, of course, was an expense that most developers would otherwise seek to minimize or eliminate. So how did Coldspring get built what it did? Now, unfortunately, this is the part of the story that still remains opaque since, as I mentioned, the Baltimore Municipal Archives have been closed for more than a year. I couldn't get into them. And contemporary journalism ignores this aspect of the project's financing, even though all the Coldspring insiders that I spoke to tell the same story. To make Coldspring happen, the city, not the developer, paid for the decks. Now, financially and legally, that must have been at best a little irregular. According to one of Safdie's staff architects at that time, working drawings did not distinguish between the deck and the superstructure. So how were payments made for one thing or the other? I mean, no one's been able to explain that to me on or off the record. In fact, some are wary even today of saying anything on the record since aspects of Coldspring's development were eventually mired in lawsuits that were eventually proved to be unrelated to Safdie's original designs. Now, in the meantime, what happened was a confluence of bad luck for America. Inflation, high interest rates, and federal level policy change, these all affected Coldspring as well as HUD-sponsored housing all across the United States. And so in the wake of those lawsuits that I mentioned, and with no city money remaining to subsidize debt construction, Coldspring's developer discontinued activity after 1983. So to wrap up, I want to remind you that Baltimore City's archives still remain closed. And so to answer some of these questions and a whole lot more, we got to get back in there and dig a little bit more. So after, so the result is that after 50 years, 50 years later, after Safdie was hired to design the project, I would argue that it's straightforward to describe what Coldspring's legacy should have been. And Safdie himself makes the case with his usual earnestness. Oops, wait, let me go back here. Oh no, where's my Safdie quote? Okay, well, I'm going to pull that up later, and I'm going to, in fact, I'm going to pull that up now. That was a link glitch, but I can recover it pretty quickly. So let's give this a try here. Bear with me here. Okay, here we go. And I'm going to end with this note. Here we go. Okay. Sharing is paused. Bring back your shared window to the front. Stop the share. Bear with me here. All right.
The city wouldn't be if it was not a valid concept. The city wouldn't exist if it was not an expression of lifestyle. It exists with a lot of shortcomings, a lot of distortions, a lot of things which are a result of its transitional character. And we in Coldspring and elsewhere are trying to restore certain rationality about it that in the process of the last maybe 50 years has become distorted because of constant change, social change, technical change, statistical change, population growth. A million things have been changing. The city's changed. It hasn't changed well. It hasn't accommodated many things in the process of change. And we're trying to restore sanity here, to restore a certain sense of rationality, which includes things like knowing your neighbor. That's precisely what this is all about, is being able to know your neighbor, but not having to run away from the city to do so.
Let's see here. So let me just wrap up with my slides one more time. So I'll say to Moshe Safdie, yeah, Moshe, that's what was supposed to have happened, but here we go. That's what was supposed to have happened, but 5 decades later, obstacles still remain to explain what your project and the legacy of the project actually was. So sorry for that glitch. I want to thank you, and I want to, of course, thank the folks who I was able to interview and the archives manager of the Columbia Association who was able to provide some excellent information. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was fantastic. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I know I was scribbling down those Safdie quotes and the Rouse quotes. We could spend a whole semester in the seminar rooms on that, the Rouse,
sure,
unpacking the Rouse quotes. But let's open it up to the audience and see if anyone has a question for you. I think you can just unmute, or maybe you have to raise your hand.
Yeah, you can either raise your hand, type your question into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself.
Fred.
Yes.
Hi, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, you know that this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm so glad that that people here in Baltimore are going deeper into it, like you are. I was wondering, and I never had a chance to really ask you about this directly, so I'll ask you now. But I was wondering if you came across, did anybody say it was ugly at the time? Because now that's the argument, right? It's not about infrastructure. It's not about kind of lifestyle or even connection to amenities. Did anybody say at the time, like, this is too strange looking to be a viable housing product?
The sources that I were referring to were all published sources in the local media, the Sun, the Afro, and I guess the Washington Post. It was also covered in the New York Times. And their architectural critics couldn't say things like that. The closest that I read that came to criticism dealt with substantive issues. Ada Louis Huxtable said, it's cute, but it, and it even might be a good idea, but this prefabrication thing is not going to work in America. I don't think that the aesthetic argument had, that sort of conservative reaction had infiltrated criticism of architecture at that time. Though by the 1990s, when people were saying, what should we do with this undeveloped land? That was certainly part of that narrative. If the concrete doesn't work, people want, make mansions, et cetera. And people who are still active in the planning process were those who made those arguments. But I would say a decade had to elapse before people felt comfortable saying things like that. I see something from Evan here. What I do know about the residents, I mean, I've visited folks who've lived there, and I've talked to some of the residents, and I'm responding to Evan's question. How do the residents feel about the development? Everybody's self-rationalizing, right? They love it, right? Because they chose to live there. The cost of the units are relatively inexpensive. It's not close to anything. There are probably some high condo fees associated with those decks. But in general, people are very pleased, and they feel that when they're able to articulate it, they feel the intimacy of the shared spaces as a positive. And their only regret is that the accounts of the early days, when everybody was a pioneer in Coldspring, there was a lot more camaraderie and shared use of those spaces, which I think has lessened as years go by. People are polite, but not, together. So in other words, Safdie's original goal probably was not realized.
Other questions?
Sure. Evan, actually, I had the exact same question as Evan, so I'll propose another one. So can you go into a little more detail about the lawsuits that you briefly referenced? I think it had something to do with construction.
Well, it had to do with leaky things, usually leaky windows and leaky skylights. And my understanding is that although there were allegations of poor design, I mean, in a lawsuit like that, the homeowners sue everyone that's ever touched the project. Ultimately, it was shown that the windows that were installed didn't conform to the windows that were designed. So that's a classic thing. Now there was a related legal issue, and I think that it's the second issue. While people might be a little more cagey, although I said that people weren't noticing, who was funding the decks, they did notice who was funding the loans, the financing that was floated to the contractor. Now, I think it may be hard to remember in this period of 1% interest, or maybe 2% financing, that by the end of the 1970s, interest rates that you would get in your bank account were started at 9%, and that financing was up in the 12s and 13s. So, I mean, the cost of money was hugely expensive, and that itself would put a kibosh on development around the United States. So to get the first and second phases done, there was some sleight of hand where some government guaranteed, federal guaranteed money was used to cover loans. And so money was put around. There was no law against it, but it evidently circumvented federal oversight in a way that raised eyebrows and in fact led to some kind of investigation. I think the people in the city were eventually sanctioned for that, even though it was again not an issue of legality as much as it was, that wasn't what the money was supposed to be for. So I think that that was one of the legal contexts to why, a project like Coldspring really hasn't been repeated.
I have a question in the chat from Dee, and it's, what is the new town contrast with the communal philosophy of sharing common spaces when compared with older historic communities like Bolton Hill? Okay, well, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about the development history of Bolton Hill. My memory tells me it was as a 19th century project. It was probably developed privately by different developers, and based on the plat coming from 1822. I would even go so far to argue that there is no philosophy of sharing common spaces in Bolton Hill. I guess there's that central green spaces that on Park Avenue, which looks like other kinds of Beaux-Arts design. So I think that, to answer the question, I think that Coldspring's philosophy was far more robust, if perhaps unrealistic. I mean, I mentioned this interest of Safdie's in infrastructure, which
usually is interpreted as technical, but he really had an interest in social infrastructure. And that's what the decks that were built at Coldspring, as well as the rest of the commercial development, that's what that represented. That was to be shared common spaces, as well as the green spaces for that matter, which were quite, quite attractive there. In other words, I think that he has a philosophy, and I'm not sure in the 19th century anybody did.
Jeremy, I have a question for you.
Well, I'm sorry, Dee had a follow-up, and she says,
Okay.
it seems older communities see the value of taking care of communal spaces in order to bring value and adherence. I think that's wishful thinking, and I think that's also an anachronistic mapping back in time about what we value, or what many of us do value, onto what appears to have been valued. Remember, the 19th century was a terrible time for exploitation and everything else that's bad, So it was even Druid Hill Park, which was part of a nationwide, initiative to create, municipally owned green spaces for its citizens. That was, I would say, an exception that mitigated real exploitative practices in the development of communities. This is my opinion. Yep.
Then I actually, Jeremy, I had a question. How would you say that this differs? I think it's a forerunner of the new urbanist communities. So in your eyes, what do you see as differences?
Well, I mean, I think from a design perspective, Safdie couldn't be less new urbanist than anybody else. I mean, new urbanist looks at historical typologies of housing and of city layouts, and argues that they were the most effective towards, and the most flexible in a lot of ways. I have to say, I do agree with that. Even though I excoriated, old 19th century development, the results are undeniably attractive, when maintained, over time. In Coldspring's case, there was no street. In fact, Safdie is ashamed of streets. He sticks them under. They stick them under the driveway here. Mm-hmm. The community is programmed, but not in a way that the new urbanists would recognize. So I think that he's very much, he's a product of the swinging metabolist 60s. I mean, and that's not invalid in itself. I mean, there are good results, but it often is correlated strongly with the presence of money and the willingness of a community to invest money in the things that make these spaces attractive, the planting, and this has been true with public housing too. You put those same big boxes, up on Slade Avenue, they're perfectly decent pieces of architecture. It's just that, in publicly financed housing, there's not the money to maintain them and to run them the right way. So.
Yeah, in my mind, it's sort of although he didn't use the new urbanist principle, you're very right. This was from the 60s, but it is sort of a forerunner of the new urban, without the streets, of course.
Yeah, well, listen, remember that at the time of the early 70s, there were lots of public housing projects, some of them actually much better than Coldspring. And I'm thinking of the one that was designed by this crazy collaborative of Eisenman and I think Jackie Robinson and Robert Robinson in New York, and some really high profile designers, maybe Jergolo was involved. And it's out in the middle of Brooklyn somewhere. Mm-hmm. Dan, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I don't remember the
I think it's not Marcus Garvey Terraces. It's something like that.
The one in Manhattan is really fantastic too. And then the ones you're talking about are in Coney Island, maybe those in the.
Oh no, I'm talking about low rises. I mean, it's 3-story carpet development and the courtyard. I mean, but they're all street facing projects. So no one's claiming that those are new urbanists, but there was a lot in the air about creating new communities in town.
Yeah, Jeremy, I had a question. I think the quotes from both Rouse and Safdie are really telling. And I didn't know anything about this kind of side plan for Park Heights. And I know you weren't, that's a yet another project down the road for somebody. But I'm wondering, maybe you could speculate a bit and think about the opportunities missed. I mean, do you feel that was a kind of genuine effort on Safdie's part to bring about some kind of social change and integration?
I think it was totally genuine on Safdie's part and Embry's part and the rest of the city government. I think I think that probably ran aground of the same problem that these other housing projects we've discussed. I think that federal funding dried up. There was no money to implement anything.
Yeah.
So the only residual value could have been what Stan was talking about, this idea of providing community dialogue up front in the planning process. Now, it sounds, I mean, we hear about that a lot today in 2020. I don't think we heard a lot about that even as late as the late 1980s, early 1990s, but it's become part and parcel of not only in Baltimore, but also around the country. Now, I don't know if there was a straight line between the two. Without any evidence, I suspect the answer is no. That I think the lessons learned under Embry and Jay Brody's housing regime were lost when they left town and when a new administration came to Baltimore.
Yeah, so the follow-up with that is, do you think some of that effort would have been better spent on actually integrating, pushing the integration of Coldspring itself and creating programs to bring, I know the housing was relatively affordable, but to bring a full, I mean, maybe you could.
Well, I mean, it was explicitly made available to African Americans as well as whites, as well as Asians. My internet is unstable. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
And this was in the face of direct, explicit criticism for that. So it never set quotas, it never did this and that, and it didn't. And the price point, though relatively low, was still higher than the price point that was mentioned in that community meeting. It was not for somebody with $10,000 a year. It was probably affordable for someone for 15 or 20. But I think it was definitely genuine. But I think that they struggled just to get it built, and so a lot of their focus, this was going to be their primary example of success, and so they had to cut a lot of corners just to make that happen. So I think they lost perhaps some of their wider vision as the implementation came through. I see some other questions.
We have a question from Anthony Dye. He says he's interested in the contrast between Roush and Safdie. It seems like most Roush projects were commercial, Cross Keys, Harbor Place, Columbia, and Safdie was more focused on housing. Is that a difference in embodiment of the differences in their perspectives or attitudes? Well,
I mean, it's certainly a difference in their profession. Roush was a developer, not a designer or an architect or even a planner. I mean, he was there to make money off of projects. He was involved in that being said, he was involved with urban renewal very early. The project over in Waverly where 28th Street kind of turns into towards Loch Raven. That was a Rouse developed urban renewal project. And Safdie is an architect, and even though he pretends to talk he claims to talk about all these social issues, he's obsessed with form, he's obsessed with geometry. So that's just one difference. But remember, Coldspring was a commercial project. There was all this town center that was supposed to be integral to the rest of the development. So I think comparing that with Columbia is quite useful. And ultimately, Columbia succeeded because I think the ground was cheaper and the kind of development there was easier to receive financing. They just tore up farmland. So, you do that in America, they'll give you money for free. But you take difficult sloping urban land and no bank is going to give you any money. And that's true even today.
So really quickly, we have a question from Stephen, and then we'll go to Samya. And then I think we're close to finishing up because I know we have a tight timeline today. Stephen's asking if the cost per square foot of the housing was comparative with other housing projects, with or without the walkways.
Yeah, I can't speak to that because I haven't seen those kinds of numbers. I think that, and which other housing projects? I think when you're building for HUD, you have a different level of oversight and overhead than building, tract homes out in the county. I think, and this as an architect, I'm fascinated by this blind spot in Safdie's vision. There's nothing cheaper, more effective, or even more efficient than stick-built construction. Okay, build a parking garage, Ben, and build 3 stories of stick-built units on top of that. That was the technology they never considered. because of this ethos of prefabrication, which eventually they had to get rid of it, but it was always there, and they never were able to sort of shake themselves of it. So, I mean, unless you're building out of balloon framing or platform framing, it's not going to be as cost effective as stuff built out of trash, which is the American way. So, okay.
And Samia, did you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, or would you like me to ask it?
Sure. No, I can do that. Hi, Jeremy. Great to see you. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Thank you for sharing the clips. The video clips were the best part for me. They're very telling. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the location and also the way the site plan is working in terms of, it really looks like a gated community. I've been there. It feels like a gated community, a nice enclave, but totally trying to distance itself from Park Heights. And I'm wondering if you could talk about if you found anything in your research that talks about how the approaches were developed and why was it felt necessary to make it a gated community?
Well, remember, it is not gated. You say it feels like a gated community, but it is not gated. And I think that the point of access was never supposed to be from Greenspring Avenue. It was supposed to be from this large commercial center, which is, if you can remember the plan, has lots of access. Even though but it is, remember, it is as a site isolated, even originally across Greenspring Avenue. Now, further down Greenspring Avenue, not only do you have a large grade going up to the Coldspring site, you have a huge grade going up to the Park Heights site. So it's, Greenspring is a valley, and it's hard to span that. I think this touches upon a little bit about my response to Sid. I think that Safdie has never been interested in urban edges, which in newer urbanism is essentially the location of porosity. It simply never occurred to him, like it didn't occur to a lot of other modernist designers of that period. So
there's no transect thinking in his plans at all.
No, and even he talked about the pedestrian. I think to me it would be a pedestrian nightmare if they ever built this thing, because I think that when you segregate the car from the person, then you kind of you emphasize the negative environmental qualities of the car, and you emphasize also the kind of the separatedness of the pedestrian from actual daily life. So again, that's a very modernist approach to things, and I think that's part of the reason for the failure.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have one last question in the chat, if you're okay with that, Jeremy.
Sure. Okay, one more.
Okay, so it says, Safdie says, it seems more influential communities, i.e. Brooklyn Heights in New York, with infrastructure landmarks have benefited more from private investments. How can the government's policies be poked and prodded to spend more towards supporting similar goals, protecting and enhancing quality, security, etc.?
It's funny. I even though I'm not from Brooklyn like Dan, I have a lot of opinions about Brooklyn because my parents are from there. And Brooklyn Heights to me is a strange kind of example to provide in this context, because it was always a rich neighborhood. It's never not been a rich neighborhood, and it's simply very different than other kinds of. And I don't think it's benefited from private investments. It was simply it was developed, and it's just the money never left. The real question, though, is the second part: is how could government's policies be poked to spend more towards? This is the bottom line problem in the United States. Every other country in the known universe, and I'm including Mars in this, has a housing ethos as part of their social contract, and the government is involved in providing housing for its citizens directly, not just indirectly. Only in America do we have this developer-led model where the most the government can provide is a form of welfare for the developer's financing. Okay, so how can we change that? Well, we need a revolution in our thinking, and how to affect that, I have no idea. But it's similar to the thing we have about guns. We have a religion that's based on this notion of private-led development, and until we change our religion, that's not going to change. So I think that the way to change it could be if rich cities, whether it's like San Francisco or Boston, tax. They're already they're relatively higher tax, but if they actually, with their higher tax base, dedicate themselves to public housing, and not developer-led, but literally publicly funded and developed housing, then we can begin to see some results, at least as examples in the United States, that are similar to what we see every day in France, Germany, and everywhere else. So I think that that's the only way in. But I'm not optimistic about our religion changing in the next 100 years. So.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's been such a great presentation, and I know you have to get out of here by 1 p.m. I think we'll go ahead and close out. I think Dan had some final remarks.
Yeah, I'm glad that Safdie Ali mentioned Brooklyn Heights, because that is the general location, not just Brooklyn Heights, of our next lecture, right? With Matthew Urbanski, the chief designer of Brooklyn Bridge Park, partner at Van Valkenburg Associates. So maybe we will hear, please come back next Tuesday at 4 p.m. Or maybe we'll hear answers to those very questions.
Well, that's an interesting example, because it's proximate, but it's not identical. I mean, it's down the hill, and it has a lot more in common with some Baltimore developments than I think it does with Brooklyn Heights. Very, very nice project.
It's a very different subject, but there could be some lessons to be learned.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
We'll see. So please join us next week at 4 p.m. next Tuesday.
Very good. Well, thank you all for having me.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was wonderful.
Great. Talk to you later then.
It'd be great to see you.
And stay well. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.